Good morning. My name is Mark Baldessari, and I'm President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you all for joining us today. PPIC is pleased to present this timely program on women and the pandemic economy. We have an outstanding group of panelists and moderator today for this program. This event is part of PPIC's 2021 speaker series on California's future. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. We would like to thank the sponsors of this series for their underwriting support. These organizations are listed on your screen and on our website. This series is also funded by the PPIC Donor Circle and the PPIC Corporate Circle, individuals and organizations that provide generous support to PPIC. Please consider joining us as a sponsor or donor to make more programs like today's possible. More information is available at ppic.org. And before we begin, if you have a question for the panelists, please send an email to the address on the screen and include your name and organization along with your question. PPIC event questions at gmail.com. We have time at the end of the program to devote to your questions. Now on to the program. We are so pleased to have veteran radio producer Queena Kim moderate today's discussion. Queena is the senior editor of Weekend Desk at KQED. Queena, thank you so much for being with us here today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Oh, okay, well, I'll kick it off now. And I wanted to say hello and welcome to the 2021 speaker series on California's future. As Mark just said, I'm Queena Kim, and I'll be moderating today's event. As you all know, the topic is women and the pandemic economy. And I wanted to start by introducing our panelists. We have Assemblymember Sabrina Cervantes. She chairs the Jobs, Economic Development, and the Economy Committee in the State Assembly. Welcome, Assemblymember. Also joining us is Secretary Lourdes Castro Ramírez. She is the Secretary of California's Business, Customer Service, and Housing. Welcome, Secretary. We also have with us Fong Kushida. She's the President and CEO of the California Asian Pacific Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, Pat. And last but not least, we have Nicole Rice, who is with the California Natural Gas Vehicle Coalition and was the policy director at the California Manufacturers and Technology Association. Thank you all for joining us. It's really nice to have such a high-powered panel here. As you know, we're going to be talking about how women have been hit hard in the recession. The Economist recently wrote that COVID-19 has triggered America's first female recession in 50 years. I guess previous recessions have hit men or the industries that men dominate especially hard, but this one is hitting women. And so I guess I wanted to just start with sort of like a broad question. What do you guys think is the most important actions we can take to support women in the workplace today? And of course, we are all women in the workforce. So I'm just curious how COVID-19 is treating you all. How's this pandemic economy treating you all? Can we start with Secretary Ramírez?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Queen. I just wanted, again, express appreciation to PPIC for the invitation to participate with this very distinguished panel. Given that this is Women's History Month, I think that the focus on women and how women and how we all have been impacted, I think is a crucial conversation to have. So specifically, Queena, to your question, you're absolutely right. This pandemic has been especially hard hitting women, right? Women have been disproportionately and unevenly impacted by the pandemic, both from a public health perspective, but also from the economic fallout of the pandemic. Some experts are actually calling this recession a she-cession because women have had greater loss in terms of jobs, greater loss in terms of housing security, and also just greater challenges caretaking. So to your point about what actions can we take, I think the first action is really to acknowledge and recognize the disproportionate impact that this has had. As an example, women across the country have lost about 5.4 million jobs, 1 million more than men. So acknowledging this fact and understanding the root cause is a critical first step. I firmly believe that when we acknowledge the root cause of why is this happening, we are able then to come up with holistic, more comprehensive solutions. This administration, Governor Newsom's administration, since day one, as it relates to responding to the pandemic, and as we begin to develop an equitable recovery, we have been focused on identifying concrete actions that address the uneven impact of the pandemic on women. And specifically, the focus that I have had through the agency that I lead is working closely on keeping women and children and families housed, preventing evictions, and expanding housing affordability, particularly for individuals and families experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, and we're going to drill into a lot of the very complicated issues, because I know this isn't just one thing. So thank you for that, for outlining that. Nicole Rice, wondering what moves we should be making in terms of addressing this. I like that she session.
Well, thank you, Queena, and thanks to PPIC for allowing me to be part of this important discussion. And again, to be on this panel with such amazing women working in this space. I think for, giving this some thought, we definitely see the coverage, the news coverage that the Secretary has talked about. There's a lot of data out there that supports the fact that women have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. And the pandemic has, created definitely some barriers and some challenges, but I also like to look at the opportunities for us to learn and grow from what we know and what has been presented through this pandemic. I think one important thing to look at is really about flexibility and how we support women in the workplace related to that. And granted, not every job is going to allow for and provide the type of flexibility that many people have seen as it relates to being able to work remotely or to work, alternate hours and things of that nature. But certainly in areas where you have professional women who are working in industries that can allow for that flexibility, to be able to offer that flexibility, whether it is through, through statutory changes, or whether it's just allowing the flexibility for the employer and the female employee to be able to have that conversation. That's definitely something that we need to explore. Secondly, I think that what we have seen also coming out of this pandemic is the types of jobs that Californians are calling careers and the limitations that those jobs provide. So we looking at and exploring opportunities to move people to higher wage, higher skilled jobs can definitely afford the type of flexibility that I started out talking with before, and give women opportunities to be able to have a better work-life balance, and frankly, to confront some of the economic realities. Definitely with childcare and dealing with school closures and the like have been significant stressors that have caused women to have to leave the workforce or to significantly reduce their participation. But also the fact that they're earning less money maybe than their male spouses, and so having to make that financial decision of which a parent needs to stay in the workforce to be able to maintain a standard of living, it definitely is causing some of those decisions where unfortunately the woman is in the place where they're having to sacrifice that participation. So those are some things that I think have risen to the top, and we have opportunities now to look at that and address some of those concerns.
Great. Assembly member Cervantes, we've been hearing about more flexibility in the workplace. I think Nicole Rice hit on sort of the plight of low-income women and a lot of these jobs being sort of systemically baked in that women have of being low income. I'm curious, what more would you add in terms of the things we should be thinking about or the ways that we could support women in the workforce?
Absolutely, and thank you again. I do also, I think this is a critical month, Women's History Month, to be having this discussion and continuing it. And so thank you to the PPIC for bringing us along this important dialogue. We know that, like many women in the workplace, in the world, I'm also a working mother. And my wife and I have 3 high energy 15-month-olds.
Oh
yes,
my goodness.
We are parents,
how's that going for you?
We are parents of triplets. But listen, we wear many hats and we have competing calls for our attention. And so with the numbers that we have seen where women have been hit the hardest, women of color, this is not surprising to hear. We know women of color have borne the brunt of social and economic costs. And so we need to ensure that we are providing support to those who have left the workplace. Women from all walks of life have decided to shift their focus to the home front, such as my wife, to prioritize childcare needs over their professional ambitions this past year. And so it's critical that we recognize that and we advocate for these women as we transition out of this pandemic and reaffirm that they're not simply just going back to work, but they are re-engaging into their professional careers that they have fought so hard to achieve prior to the pandemic, especially women of color. And so we're looking at workplace equity bills. We're looking at access to childcare, family-friendly workplaces, rehiring and retention bills. And so I'm honored to also work alongside the Legislative Women's Caucus as we look at prioritizing some of these issues that are before us.
Great. Well, I can't wait to drill into all those policy initiatives. But first, let's get to Pat Fong Kushida. Can you tell us how, some of the actions we can take to support women in the workplace, stuff that you might not have been hearing or you wanted to add on?
So thank you, Queena, and thank you to the PPIC for allowing this very important discussion today. So I'm going to start with this. 80 to 90% of California's economy is run on the backs of small business and small businesses that are probably 10 or less employees. And if you think about the impact of having women leave the workforce, and I think that Nicole referenced over 1 million have left that workforce since the pandemic. Over 1 million people leaving the workforce, most of that impacts small business. And unfortunately, small business doesn't have I would say, the deep resources to be able to fill those gaps. So that hit to our California economy is real, and it's happening now. And so you have multiple families of generations of folks just trying to figure out how they're going to keep their small businesses together, right? And if a large part of that workforce is women, it's devastating. And there's been studies that say we're not going to get back to employment levels until 2024. I mean, we're looking at 3 or 4 years of this, right? So when I talk to a lot of our members, and we talk about what kind of policies can be adopted in order to be able to help our members through this crisis, certainly the Family Medical Leave Act, right, which gave us 12 weeks for 12 months is fine, but we need other types of safety nets. And so we want to talk and have real discussions with policymakers about how do we do an extended period around a family leave policy, right? And how do we make sure that even if it is unpaid, that benefits should still be available to our folks, right? We also want to encourage women to open up about the pandemic gap, right? So we see in a large part that when there's a gap in a resume or gapped in what they did, they need to be able to talk about that openly, right? And talk about it on their LinkedIn and talk about it on the resume and be able to talk to folks about that. We also see that when there are more attention to people actually wanting to hire women, that the pool of women candidates are bigger, right? So you have much more ability to hire, if you have more women candidates, so more women in the workforce. The other thing that is a movement that's happening, we talk about internships, but they're calling them now returnships. And this is a new movement, right? And so there are major companies like a Walmart, like Netflix, like PayPal, who actually have working on with a nonprofit called Path Forward. I think 75 companies are participating in this, but it really is a program designed around returnship, like internships, right? Which is upskill, which is making sure that the safety nets are there, which is making sure that people can actually return to the jobs that were there. And if they can't, what kind of skills are they going to be needed to come back? So a lot of this is really being focused now on what they would call returnships in companies. And I think that that's so important. But it's a real problem for our small businesses because we don't have the luxury of having returnships. We don't have the luxury of having internships. We're not hiring hundreds of people, right? We're hiring 10 people. And so this
can you, I wanted to drill in a little bit because you do talk to a lot of small business folks and talking about sharing that pandemic pain, especially as it relates to women. What are some specific stories that you're hearing in terms of how the small business folks in your organization are faring?
Well,
what are the specific pain points for women in your area?
So, Queena, this is a really difficult time for, I'm going to get a little bit of emotional here, but this is a very difficult time for AAPI businesses. We had a federal administration at the very top level who was basically saying, because of this pandemic, that it was a China virus. And in January of 2020, because that statement was made, we saw an immediate effect on our businesses. And then you add that on to March of 2020, when the governor, obviously California, had to make some decisions and we effectively shut down California's economy in March of 2020. We were already affected back in January, and you layer that on. And now you layer on what's happening currently under the AAPI hate instances. This is real, this is painful, and it's happening in all of our Chinatowns, Japantowns, Koreatowns, Little Saigons across California. And so when you talk about that impact to that small business, and if they employ women in those places of business, not only did they have to leave because of family issues, right? Because of things that all of us have talked about how a woman in the family is the primary caretaker and everything that happens with that, right? We just don't have business.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma though, right? Because in other places you can do the returnships like you're talking about, and that my parents were small business people, so I totally feel this pain. But there's it's such a specific dilemma because many funnily run businesses, if you just go out, there's no returnship, you're just out of business. And I'm curious as to what sort of policy changes or the stuff that you guys are working on, or what are you hearing from your merchants in terms of seeing them through or helping them make them bounce back in sort of a non-traditional environment?
Well, certainly it helps when you have a safety net, and really applaud the Assembly member's efforts around this because she's been on the forefront in fighting the good fight for our small businesses. I can't say enough about Sabrina Cervantes and the leadership that she has within the state legislature. I mean, she's passionate about how to help small businesses, right? So those are the kind of folks we need in the state legislature. We need folks that understand this is real pain that's happening. We need folks that understand that there has to be a safety net. So, the $1 billion+ grant program that just hit the streets in March, and they're extending that through, I think, the end of this month, even to May. That's really helping a lot of our minority small businesses because they've said, let's focus on those smallest businesses, those businesses most impacted. So this is up to 25,000. Did I just freeze? Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, you just did freeze for a second, but we can hear you fine. So if you want to keep talking.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize because my video is just, anyway. So those things really are important, right? Those kind of safety nets, right? And certainly the way that this next, I call it stimulus, but whatever iteration of the federal government's, relief package is going to look like, the more that can get down into our communities of color, the more that we can get that on the ground into these communities, the better off we will be, because we need those safety nets in order for them to survive. We need those safety nets just to be able to make payroll. This is basic.
Yeah.
So I'm just really appreciative of Assemblymember Cervantes' leadership and everybody who's on the call today.
Well, Assemblymember Cervantes, that's a nice shout out there. You also represent the 60th District of Southern California that includes Riverside, Corona area. I'm curious, I want to hear some about those policy changes you're making, but also what have you been hearing from your constituents in your district? And I'm imagining you're hearing a lot from the small businesses, because it sounds like you're very active in that space.
Absolutely. And, I just want to say, it takes many stakeholders to be successful. And I appreciate the recommendations that have been provided to our jobs committee. And so I just want to say thank you, Pat. And we worked very closely with Nicole, over the last several years. And so again, it takes a strong coalition to get to our end goals and addressing some of our biggest challenges, especially within our small business community and our minority-owned businesses. We're still developing many of the recommendations, but there are a few items that I can share with you about our work. First off is addressing the economic disparities is really multifaceted. With the Great Recession, we saw really an overall drop in household wealth that has been never fully recovered, and especially parts of our state, right? The Central Valley part that I represent in the Inland Empire, Western Riverside County, but especially for people of color. And so we need to learn from that. And we have to build a range of programs that really support wealth creation, asset formation, and not just about jobs, but this means housing, healthcare, childcare, and education. So we work very closely with many of my other colleagues who work within those community jurisdictions. But from my committee's perspective, my focus during this COVID challenge has been focused on business retention, small business creation, workforce training, and reemployment. And so just quickly about that I like to share with you is that we are trying to push not just policy, but also through the budget to really help implement AB 1106, which is supporting the enhancement of a regional training network that's capable of working hand in hand with our business owners, our business service providers, and other workforce partners to get people back to work. And that also means especially women who have been the most impacted, women of color. And so we need to look at the data that we are seeing and actually have policies that reflect that data. And so that is why we bring economists, researchers, academic researchers, into the fold, because it's important to take that data and work with it. And so let me just share with you that, we have, California must respond to our workforce challenge with training models that actually have demonstrated the ability to rapidly respond to individual training needs of new and incumbent workers. And so this is something very important that we're looking at. I'm hoping to get through the legislative process, but also through the budgetary process. Again, we're still taking on and looking at different policy recommendations, but look forward to working with our different stakeholders to get us to this next point so that we can actually build back better and learn from 10 years ago when we had the Great Recession. When it comes to my constituency, you were asking some of the top issues that are coming before us. We are certainly getting asked, what are we doing when it comes to a lot of the housing inability? How are we prioritizing our economic recovery and working with the federal administration and receiving these stimulus dollars? And so these are very real questions that we're also posing within my jobs jurisdiction. Are we prepared? Are we prepared to take on the stimulus dollars? And what do we need to do? Are we asking the right questions? And so, this is a part of the work that I'm doing with the administration as well. But I will share with you childcare. We get so many questions on childcare, families that are hit hardest, parents who are hit hardest. How are we prioritizing the need for quality and affordable childcare? And so this is not just a women's caucus issue. This is a family issue. This is an economic issue for our country. And so this is something that our Women's Caucus is working on right now. This has been a highlighted priority, a pillar within the Women's Caucus. And so I will leave it at that, because we are still diving into some of our policy priorities for the Women's Caucus that we'll be voting on today, actually. And so I look forward to working with you all once we push those policy priorities so that we can get the support of other organizations to really get us to the finish line.
Great. I want to pick up on that childcare idea. But I also wanted to tell folks that if you are listening in right now, we are taking questions. If you want to ask a question, please submit it to PPIC event questions. And there it is on the screen right now. If you email it, we will get them in our chat and we can start asking questions as soon as possible. I guess I wanted to hit on the idea of childcare. I feel like, it's almost cliche by now that the pandemic is putting a spotlight on these inequities. One of the biggest ones, and still exists in the home, actually, many homes, is the work when it comes to childcare, right? There's a study out by the Federal Reserve that found that moms suffered the most during the pandemic because they had to leave to take care of the children. The group that fared the best were dads, even more than single men, which was sort of interesting. You all work in the area of economic development. I'm curious, childcare has always been a real issue for women and families. I don't feel like this is a new issue. Anybody who's got friends who've got children know that this is a huge pain point. And yet it's really not been well addressed in business places, or not many of the ones I've worked in. Is there more of a consciousness and real muscle, real conversations being had right now in your spheres? You are in economic development, about having to deal with childcare in terms of as a real factor of economic development. And I guess that's sort of open to anybody. So I don't know, Nicole Rice, if you wanted to take that on, or I don't want to put you on the spot, but if anybody's been thinking about this in your spheres, or it's been becoming more of a conversation.
Thanks, Queena. Yeah, no, I mean, from an employer perspective, this is something that employers have to grapple with all the time, as, they deal with, employees that are parts of family units, or that have, as a single parent, and have the needs of childcare, and how do you balance that? I know there are many conversations that are going on in the legislative arena around this area, as Assemblymember Cervantes has led to. I'm sure that we're going to see some great policies coming forth from the Legislative Women's Caucus on this. I think my only thing to say and add to this conversation is, yes, that there is, this pandemic has revealed this issue. It's come to head again as something that we need to look at. And to Pat's point, sitting down, industry, policymakers, trying to figure out how we can really make this work. Because overall, what we saw with the pain points of where our, economic response to COVID has been, is that we need to make sure that we maintain a healthy economy. And in doing that, we also need to try to create some balances from the lessons that we've learned from COVID. So that's going to require everybody coming to the table and having these conversations to make sure that it can work for all stakeholders involved in this.
Mm-hmm. Pat, Fong Kushida, I'm wondering if the small businesses, if I know that they've, it's not an easy issue for them to tackle, but has it become more of a conversation, or just something that they're rallying more around, the idea of childcare?
I think that it's probably the number one issue that prevents folks returning full-time into employment. And we know that if we had more child-friendly policies in the workplace, it might be able to solve some of those issues. So, there are instances where we see our small businesses allow, their folks to bring their kids to work if they need to. But we're still under that same, historically for years of the way that workplaces are formed. I mean, it was difficult for a lot of folks just to go remote because they weren't used to that, right? And it's difficult change for a lot of folks to be able to do remote work and not have everybody in an office setting again. And that's a big change for people, a lot of people in a lot of workplaces. So, but I do think that the COVID has laid bare these inequities, but it also has given us an opportunity. It is given us policymakers and business leaders and community leaders an opportunity to have those kinds of conversations that probably are long overdue, right? Okay, I'm freezing again, so I'm going to stop my video, sorry. Are long overdue. And I just think that, look, when I started the chamber, I'm going to tell you guys, I've been doing chamber work since 1998, so I'm old. I'm probably the oldest living chamber executive ever, anyway, in California. But when I first started,
I doubt that, but yes.
When I first started, I actually took my daughter to work. I had adopted my daughter from China. And, I was very reluctant to put her into daycare because I wanted to bond with her. And so I remember distinctly bringing her to work and making a little place for her underneath my desk, and answering the calls and doing what I needed to do with her. And there was fear there because I thought, oh gosh, if somebody comes into the office and sees my daughter, the whole thing, right? So there wasn't a family-friendly policy in my little chamber organization, and I just kind of made it up as I was going along. And so I do think that COVID allows us the opportunity to think about how to do work differently now. Mm-hmm. So we know, and I'm going to tell you, I now have 32 plus employees. We're not going to return to an office. I have made the decision to allow them to feel safe, and everybody's going to be working remotely from now on. And that's a big decision, but also it's freeing in a way because people now have the flexibility to go about and do the work that they need to do as long as they're getting their work done. And I think that those are the kind of conversations we need to have with businesses and with and policymakers and everybody, because then the policies can then be adapted towards that new norm, right? I mean, what are the resources that are going to be needed in a virtual digital workforce? What does that look like? What do those policies look like? And then how do we get Main Street businesses that and those folks that are employed in businesses that have to return, right? I mean, they don't have the luxury of working remotely. How do we make sure we have enough policies in place with respect to childcare and medical leave and all those things that they desperately need in order to make sure that they can provide a living for their families? And that's where I think that we have to set those priorities and make those priorities real. So, I'm actually optimistic about at least starting to have those types of conversations.
Well, we are starting to see a little bit of a movement. We've got that new Biden's new $1.9 trillion virus relief package. There's the tax credit in there, which we've heard a lot about flexibility here, but for a lot of low-income working folks who don't have that flexibility, there's a little chunk of money, I assume, that worked for that. Also, there's a lot of money there for housing relief. And Secretary Ramirez, your agency oversees issues like affordable housing and homelessness. You're also, looks like, overseeing the distribution of this massive rent relief fund the state is doling out right now. I'm curious, are you seeing that women are being disproportionately hit by this pandemic? And it does seem like this is the kind of thing that Pat is talking about in terms of the broader safety net that we need to start shoring up for families and women.
Yes, most definitely. I just, want to sort of, again, acknowledge everything that has been said by Pat and Nicole and Assemblymember Cervantes about the disproportionate impact that this has had on women, particularly women of color. And, as we look at the numbers in the state, working women, Latinas have been, 29% of all the jobs that have been lost since May 2020 to now have been, 29% of those jobs have impacted Latinas versus 9% impacting white women. So it is important, right, that as we look at policy recommendations and as we look at program recommendations and or programs and solutions, that we not lose sight of, the facts of how this recession or recession is affecting women of color. Specifically in the housing space, Queena, I definitely want to sort of draw the connection. I said early on that it's important to start off by acknowledging the problem and then looking at the root cause of why we're in this situation. And so I'm just going to sort of draw that line in the housing space. So in California, 76% of women-headed households with children are renters. They rent. Many of these households have been hard hit with job loss because there's an overrepresentation of women in the sectors that have been most impacted by COVID-19. This includes service sectors, low-wage job sectors. So these, women head of households with children are having a hard time paying their rent. They're more likely of receiving an eviction notice. And so they're fighting to stay housed. And, given the already difficult time that folks are having in our state with accessing housing that is affordable, there's really no place to go, right? And so we have been laser focused on working with the legislature and as an administration to since day one to protect families, to prevent displacement and evictions. So early on in March of 2020, the governor put into place an eviction moratorium. In September of 2020, we launched the Housing is Key campaign which extended eviction prevention protections and included a campaign with a number of nonprofits and stakeholders providing resources and tools to prevent displacement and evictions. Many of these protections were set to expire this past January 30th of 2021. And thanks to the legislature and the governor, they were able to champion Senate Bill 91, which is the COVID Tenant Relief Act. This specific bill extended eviction protections through June 30th of 2021, and also established the rent relief program that you've just mentioned. The rent relief program is funded through funding from U.S. Treasury. The state received $2.6 billion to be able to provide rent relief, which includes accrued rent from from April 1st of 2020 through March 31st of 2021. And I'll share with you that last week on Monday, March the 15th, we launched the California COVID Rent Relief Program. And in just over a week, we have received 25,000 applications, completed applications, of which 53% are coming from women. They're the ones that are applying for this assistance. And the vast majority, almost 80%, are low-income women making below 30% of AMI.
Oh, wow.
So I think it's important to not lose sight of the disproportionate impact when it comes to women of color, working women, but also income, right? This pandemic has also hit working poor women or women that are in these sectors that pay low wage even much more, right? And so as we look at the recovery efforts, I think it's critical that we do everything to ensure that that this population and that, that women that have been most, impacted, that we build solutions around them to the point of rebuilding sort of a safety net. And I'm just, very excited to see at the federal level, there's recognition, and the American Rescue Plan will bring in some additional resources that will enable us to provide direct relief, and that, will enable us to serve more households that have been impacted.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Secretary, for putting that in context. And actually, it sort of reminds me of a quote that I wanted to read here, which is Brookings put out a paper, and it started by saying, quote, "COVID-19 is hard on women because the US economy is hard on women. And this virus excels at taking existing tensions and ratcheting them up." But many of the things you mentioned about how we have a systemic problem here of women being baked into low income jobs and treating them that way and whatnot. So thank you for giving us that overview. We do have a question from one of the audience members here. It's Max Vargas with First Five California. And the question is, childcare providers, who are mostly women of color, are being forced to close their doors due to lack of funding and support needed to remain operational. What role and investments can the public and private sector play in supporting and expanding childcare access? And we're also ensuring we're not doing so on the backs of childcare workers that are often, have children that they also have to take care of, but they're taking care of the children that they're being paid to take care of. So yeah, I think this is a big issue. Even it's going to be part of that bouncing back that we keep talking about, is with schools reopening in various timelines, and also childcare facilities having closed down. How is that part of the bounce going to work? Or what are you all hearing or working on in terms of bringing back these childcare centers? And also this time around, we're talking a lot about making it better, maybe making it so that these childcare workers can also take care of their own children while they're working.
It's an infrastructure issue. And I so appreciate the Secretary's comments, because the investment that needs to get made is an investment in structural change. So what we found, a lot of our childcare providers, right, even if they were in business, because they couldn't take as many childcare, couldn't take as many kids in as they could because of the pandemic, they couldn't pencil out for them, right? Where they could do 8 to 1 previously, that number dropped significantly through COVID. And so, and I think the gentleman who actually put this question in is right. Most of the folks that are childcare workers are lower income women who work in childcare settings. So it is going to have to be a structural change in how we address some of this stuff. So we can't throw stimulus money in just so that we patch it during this crisis, but what can we do structurally, fundamentally, to change the way that we currently run those systems, right? And those are the kind of conversations we need to have, I think.
Mm-hmm.
If I may add on to that.
Yes, please do.
This is a very a good discussion that we're having, a discussion that many of my Women Caucus colleagues and I have had. COVID-19 has only highlighted for many why childcare providers are critical and should be respected for providing essential infrastructure, as Pat just mentioned. And so we even have to have that discussion about the reimbursement rates that childcare providers are receiving. And so this is something that we have to look at, not just from a policy perspective, but what are we going to do within our budget to really show that we respect childcare providers.
Mm-hmm. This is a little bit of far field, but it also seems that we're talking a lot about policy. It also seems there needs to be a cultural shift. When I read that statistic from the Federal Reserve that married men are faring the best of every category, that tells me that there needs to be, I don't know, some sort of rethinking in the home. And then it also strikes me that while women are making a lot of inroads into the legislature and policymaking positions, it's still very much dominated by men who sort of grew up in this more traditional culture where women were expected to take care of household goods. And I don't know, how much can policy and government affect that? I'm wondering if you all have given this any thought in terms of the cultural element of the change that needs to happen.
We need a whole nother panel for that one. I'm just gonna say. We're gonna need a whole other panel discussion for that. So we can't legislate what happens in the
Yeah.
home, right? But what we can do is create family-friendly policies that are structurally built in, not just a one-time hit from stimulus, but to Assembly members' point, built in to a budget that honors and values, right? Honors and values the work of working women. Say that 3 times: working women, the work of working women. And that's really what we need to do, because there's no, culturally, there's just, we need a whole nother panel.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'll save that.
Thank you. A whole other panel for that one.
Secretary.
Well, Queena, if I could just
yes.
piggyback onto that, completely agree with Pat. Invite us back next time for that discussion.
Yes.
But I also think, there's out of COVID has arisen a lot of discussions, including, kind of heightening and expanding the discussion about women in places of leadership, as you just mentioned. And so to that point, this just highlights how in, public-private sectors, women in leadership can bring a different perspective to this conversation, talking about, a cultural shift, just a basic understanding. There's a variety of pain points. Well, I shouldn't call them pain points, but a variety of decision points that women make on a daily basis that their male counterparts may not make. And I started my comments by mentioning that fact that, if you're in a household and you're in a situation where you have to deal with how are you going to handle your children during this difficult time, and you have one individual who's making a higher income than the other, common sense would lend itself that you would try to hold on to the higher paying job. Well, so that opens up a can of worms of a whole conversation about, are women getting opportunities for higher paying jobs? And even when they're in those higher paying jobs, are they being brought to the table to talk about the family friendly policies that we've been discussing, and how, things might need to change or adjust for the change of where our culture is going in this aspect. And certainly women of color can bring an even different perspective about that. Maybe not necessarily for themselves, but definitely for folks that they know in their communities, and even through their upbringing, because a lot of women of color are, first or maybe second generation realization of a dream that their parents or grandparents had for, to have a generation of successful professionals. So again, this is a bigger conversation to have, but I think as we get more women into these positions of decision making, where they're being invited to the table and their perspectives are being valued and respected, then you will start seeing a shift in how people view some of these conversations that generally just happen, around the table when we're talking to each other.
Yes. Secretary Ramirez?
Yes, I was just going to share something, because I couldn't agree more with what Nicole said. Leadership matters, and having representation matters. And I was going to share a very quick story. So when we launched the rent relief program last week, we had a number of opportunities to visit with media, particularly ethnic media. And just a few days ago, I received a message from a young lady who's 15 years old, whose parents I know from when I lived in Linwood, California. And she said, "I saw you on TV. I saw you talking about this rent relief program, or this program, and I would like to do what you do. How do I do that?" And so I think it's also important, right, for as we talk about workforce and opening up opportunities for women to lead in different fields, how important it is, the way that young women, young girls see us, and why it's important for more of us to be in these positions, right? Because our impact and our influence is being noted. So I just wanted to share that again as the important role that we all play, right, in this work.
Yes, no, thank you for that reminder. And it's all, yeah, I hear that a lot.
We know, would I be able to add on?
Oh yeah, of
I
course.
think it's
Yes,
very
yes.
important because
Yes.
yesterday was only, what was it? It was Women's Equal Pay Day. And so I just want to add on that, it's not merely enough just talking about pay disparities, but we actually do something about it. And that starts with not just electing more women to public office, but by placing women in these management positions, and ensuring that, we know that when working women succeed, that our families succeed, that our nation succeeds. So we need to ensure that, women are at the table every day in these different positions, because we bring personal experiences and how real policies affect our lives.
Do you think the pandemic is making people really receptive to these conversations and also emboldening women more? I guess what I'm trying to get at is I found in my own past that in order to keep up with the men and their work schedule, often the women don't bring these issues into the workplace, even though they might feel them in their lived experience, or that they see them, for obvious competitive reasons. And I'm curious, in your workplaces and the people you deal with in your organizations, have women been more emboldened to actually start bringing these topics up without the fear of feeling like I'm not being competitive enough, or I'm not bringing game?
Well, I can only speak from my experience, but when, particularly through this pandemic, right, I'm usually one of the only 2 women maybe in a boardroom, and I'm usually the only minority. And so, and I'm looking at my colleagues here, and we're all minorities. And so what we're talking about here, that we have to be that much smarter, that much more strategic, I think, and about how we approach and when we approach and how and when to engage. But because of COVID, right, I have seen a remarkable shift in my own thing, where I'm just saying, you know what, I'm just going to speak my mind. We don't have time to waste anymore, right? Before, I probably was a little bit more strategic, and when I felt that I could lend my voice because I wanted to make sure it was heard, that I wanted to make sure that that I was taken seriously. It's difficult being an only woman in a boardroom, guys. It's very difficult. And it's really interesting the way that men interact in a boardroom without a woman there. I'm just going to say that. And I'm sure all of you guys have experienced it. So for me, though, I've just said, you know what, we don't have enough time for any of that anymore. And I'm just going to, be me. And being me is this, right? So I do think that it has given us more of a freedom to be able to say that we don't have time for this, and actually to demand that other folks see more of what we have been seeing on a daily basis. Right?
So it's that sense of urgency, right, that makes it
Oh,
a real conversation, not just a theoretical, right. We have another audience question here, and I guess we touched on this a little bit, but could you all or any of you talk about the role that federal and state relief packages have in supporting women and their economic well-being, and how important will this support be? I don't, we touched on it with the housing a bit. I don't know if you want to continue with that, Secretary Ramirez, or if there's other things that folks wanted to pick up on.
Yeah, definitely, Queena. So, so I spoke a little bit about, the relief focused on housing stability or keeping families housed through the rent relief program. But, I'm also, of course, very pleased to see that the American Rescue Package included not only direct financial relief of $1,400 for adult and children, but also an ongoing subsidy of $300 for every child for 12 months. And I think that that's, again, sort of a recognition, right, that it is very important for us to address child poverty and family poverty. And I think that this is a moment in time for us to build on these investments that are happening that impact working women, women who have children, women who lead, their households. So as the state leverages the federal investments, I do think that we are also making the right investments to not just sort of address the immediate issues of direct relief, but really to lay the foundation so that women and families are able to not just survive the pandemic, but thrive.
So we've all
recovery.
Yes.
And if I could add on to that, just through the $1.9 trillion stimulus package, the Biden administration, one of their top priorities, as has been mentioned, is ensuring economic recovery. And so through that package, one of the key issues that was mentioned is helping Black and Hispanic women return to work within a year. And so I do want to make sure that that was highlighted.
Great. Well, I would love to drill into that more. And also, maybe we can get a drink and talk about that issue that was the culture issue that's too big to discuss here. But in the meantime, we're going to have to wrap this up. I wanted to thank you all for participating in this conversation. It was really interesting and empowering. So it felt like there's actually real conversations and real movement that's happening. And I don't always feel that way after one of these. So thank you very much for giving me that little bit of hope in these sort of dark times. The PPIC would also like to thank all the sponsors of this event. And finally, thanks for all the audience here for joining us today online. If you pre-registered for this event later today, you're going to receive a survey. I know the PPIC would very much appreciate it if you guys sent your feedback back in. I wanted to tell you again, thanks so much for joining us. My name is Queena Kim, and please be safe and have a good afternoon. Thank you.